under a sky chiseled by winter winds and sacred smoke. A boy was born into the heart of a people whose story was already centuries in the making. The year was 1822, and the place was along the North Platte River, in what would one day be called Nebraska. But at that time, it was still Lakota land, unmapped by outsiders, governed by the rhythm of the buffalo herds and the teachings of elders around the fire. The boy would be called Mapia Luta, Red Cloud. His mother came from the Oglala band of the Lakota Sioux, his father a Brule. But his father died while he was still young, and Red Cloud's mother brought him to live among her people. Raised by an uncle, Old Smoke, Red Cloud learned early the weight of silence, the language of horses, and the sound of distant hoofbeats carried on the prairie wind. He was not born into greatness. He became it, slowly, like a river carving through stone. The frontier was changing. The fur traders came first, wrapped in coarse wool and trailing the scent of alcohol and iron. Then the surveyors, then the soldiers, and with each crossing of wagon wheel over ancestral ground, the old balance faltered. Red Cloud watched it all, watched the treaties signed with forked tongues, watched the buffalo thinned by rifles not meant for meat, watched the trails that once led to vision quests, now run red with blood and iron rails. By the 1850s, Red Cloud had become a respected war leader among the Oglala. Tall, intense-eyed, with a voice like flint scraping flint. He carried himself with a dignity that didn't demand loyalty. It evoked it. He led raids against rival tribes and later against U.S. military outposts, not for conquest, but for preservation. The Powder River country, sacred land cradled between the Big Horns and the Black Hills, became the fulcrum on which the entire struggle would pivot. The Bozeman Trail, carved recklessly through the Powder River Basin by prospectors chasing Montana gold, cut straight through hunting grounds that were not only essential to Lakota survival, but to their very spiritual cosmology. Red Cloud saw it for what it was, not merely a road, but an invasion, an omen of the end. In 1866, when the U.S. Army began constructing forts along the Bozeman Trail, Fort Reno, Fort Phil Kearney, Fort C.F. Smith, Red Cloud did something no native leader had yet accomplished on such a scale. He said no. Not through petitions, not with feathers and diplomacy, but with war. A war he would lead and win. The winter of 1866-67 was brutal, and the wind cut through skin like shards of bone. Snow covered the ground around Fort Phil Kearney, and the men stationed there feared not the weather, but the shadow that stalked the timber trails. Red Cloud, aided by fellow war chiefs such as Crazy Horse and the enigmatic High Backbone, orchestrated a campaign of siege and deception. Their most stunning victory came on December 21st, 1866, in what would later be called the Fetterman Massacre. But among the Lakota, it was not called massacre. It was called justice. Captain William Fetterman, a brash Civil War veteran, had boasted that with 80 men, he could ride through the entire Sioux nation. He was given that chance, and Red Cloud made certain it was his last. The plan was simple in form, devastating in execution. A decoy party led by Crazy Horse lured Fetterman and his men into a ravine beyond Lodge Trail Ridge. There, waiting in silence beneath the snow-laden branches, were over 1,000 Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho warriors. The fight was over in less than an hour. Every single one of Fetterman's men was killed. Some say not a single trigger was pulled on the American side. Red Cloud, though not physically present, had orchestrated the moment like a symphony of retribution. The U.S. government, stunned and humiliated, responded with more troops, more forts, and more arrogance. But Red Cloud held firm. He harassed supply lines. He isolated outposts. He struck at dusk and vanished by dawn. The war did not rage like a wildfire. It smoldered, relentless and consuming. In 1868, after 2 years of bloodshed, Washington called for a council. They sent men with treaty papers, hollow promises inked by hands that would later pretend amnesia. But this time, it was Red Cloud who held the power. He did what no tribal leader before had managed. He forced the United States to sue for peace on his terms. The result was the Fort Laramie Treaty of 1868. Under it, the U.S. agreed to abandon the forts along the Bozeman Trail and recognize the Powder River country as unceded territory, sovereign to the Lakota. It was a moment unequaled in the history of native resistance. Red Cloud had not only defended his people's land, he had compelled the greatest military power on the continent to retreat. Soldiers burned their own forts as they left. The Bozeman Trail was closed. The Powder River ran clear again. For a time. For a brief, flickering moment in a century stained with betrayal. A man of the plains had forced the empire to bend. Yet, as history so often teaches, victories for the indigenous were rarely permanent. Red Cloud traveled to Washington, D.C. in 1870, where he met President Grant face to face. In photographs from that journey, he wears a tailored suit, but his eyes remain unchanged, dark, unyielding, searching beyond the frame. He spoke with senators, posed for cameras, walked the halls of American power, and returned to his people with the truth he never stopped repeating. They made us many promises, more than I can remember, but they never kept but one. They promised to take our land, and they took it. Red Cloud had hoped the Fort Laramie Treaty would be honored, that peace would finally allow the Lakota to live freely in the Black Hills and Powder River country. But in 1874, Custer led an expedition into the Black Hills and discovered gold. The White Rush returned like locusts. By 1876, war came again. Red Cloud, older now, no longer led warriors into battle. That mantle had passed to others, Crazy Horse, Sitting Bull. But he watched as the old agreements were shredded, as the lands he had defended bled into mining claims and railroad tracks. He chose to continue fighting with words. As the U.S. established reservations and slowly strangled the freedom of the plains, Red Cloud remained a negotiator, a speaker, an unbowed witness to the unraveling of his people's sovereignty. In his later years, Red Cloud lived on the Pine Ridge Reservation. He converted to Christianity, but never surrendered his Lakota identity. He continued to challenge federal policy, to resist allotment programs and efforts to dismantle tribal unity. He was a bridge between eras, the boy who had learned to hunt with bow and arrow, and the elder who watched airplanes fly overhead. He gave interviews to newspapers, dictated his thoughts to biographers. "I am Red Cloud," he said. "I fought to keep our land, our ways. I am the last chief who did." When he died in 1909, at the age of 87, Red Cloud had outlived Custer, Grant, Crazy Horse, and Sitting Bull. He had survived the Buffalo Wars, the Indian Schools, the Dawes Act, and wounded knee, but he had not survived the slow erasure of the world he was born into. And yet, something remains. His name, his war, his defiance. The Powder River still whispers. The hills still remember. Red Cloud did not vanish into myth. He carved his name into the very fabric of American history, a name not merely etched in stone, but carried on the wind in the stories of those who still speak Lakota, still ride, still remember. He was not a man who asked for history's approval. He demanded its respect. In a century of defeat, he achieved the unthinkable. He beat the United States Army, not with superior numbers or weapons, but with clarity of vision, unity of purpose, and the iron will of a man who understood that land is not just geography, it is soul. And as long as that truth is remembered, Red Cloud's war is not over. It rides on. History doesn't echo unless we choose to listen. If Red Cloud's story moved you, if his defiance, his vision, or his legacy stirred something within, let it be more than a passing thought, like this video, so that others might find it. Subscribe to this channel to journey deeper into the stories that textbooks often leave behind. And leave a comment below, because remembrance is a shared act. What do you take from Red Cloud's war? What does resistance look like today? Speak, reflect, remember, because the past isn't buried, it's waiting to be honored.